those who are listening to the recording, we've just been talking for a while. You're getting to know Greta and her family, Michael and Michelle Jones and Hazel and Abby. But Greta's with us today, so we're excited about this. And yeah, this has been a few years in the making, Greta, getting together. And I kind of titled this to, it got sent out as Healing of the Heart, at any age. And my memory and just my little perspective here, just introduce Greta. I met Greta when she was in Montreal, but she was quite young back then. And her parents, the whole family, were basically the founders of what was first called the Living Room and is now recently called Jubilee. And so she's got a very interesting perspective. We were talking about it earlier, just about what it's like to grow up in a family that's on mission, if you will. And yeah, well, and we're going to unpack that a little bit. But mostly what I've asked Greta how we got here is about 7 years ago. We were trying to figure this out, Greta, that about 7 years ago, you went through some healing, some inner healing that parents had set up, and your sisters did as well. And how old was Abby and Hazel when you guys did that?
Oh my gosh.
Because that's
Abby might have been maybe 4 years old, and I think Hazel was like 7 or 8 or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I remember your parents came up to Calgary and they were coming to a conference we were having out at Entheos, and they hung out with Ralph and Glenda and myself, and they were talking about that experience for you guys. And I still remember especially your story, or at least the way your dad told the story. So we're going to find out if what he told me was aligned with your experience. But I remember having this moment going, man, this is incredible to hear how, I mean, you'll hear this around our world, but then in the States, I hear it often. There's no such thing as a junior Holy Spirit type of thing. It's not like God, can't do any, he has to get small or something to, we all know the verses, right? Matthew and places where God, the Father, speaks through Jesus saying, when the disciples are hanging out and the crowds are pressing in and they're all looking for solutions and answers and touches, and they're keeping the kids away. And Jesus said, no, let these little ones come to me. And unless you become like one of these children, you can't even enter the kingdom. And it's really interesting. We kind of all know that the journey of our lives is along the way. I think we've heard people like James Jordan and others would say, you're most who you are when you're the youngest, in a sense, because you're not yet impacted by all the stuff in the world that shapes our hearts and things. And many of us have now come to this understanding that when he came to heal the broken hearts, it says, and to open the blind eyes, open the eyes of the heart, and free us from captivity, things that hold us back from living our lives, and to announce that this is the year of the Lord. And so what does that look like? Do you have to wait till you get older to get free, or how does God work in our lives? And so Greta and I were on a call. I was talking to your dad a while back, and you popped in and we caught up. And I just really had this nudge to say, hey, man, I think your story would be amazing to share with parents and people who want to listen, and just to hear how neat God is in this and what it's shaped and formed you. So that's what we're going to do. And if you have any questions, as we said, text them to Jody and along the way, but we're going to open it up for some direct questions too at the end. But we'll, if you have some that you want to remember, send them off to Jody. So Greta, let's just jump in, and why don't you introduce yourself, because there's people who are going to be listening who haven't had the chance to be on the preamble, but give everybody a story, because you're now turning 18 next Sunday.
Yeah.
And literally you spent 9 years approximately in Canada and approximately 9 years in the States. So start from there. And how did you end up in Canada? And yeah, go there.
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm Greta Jones. Nice to meet you all. Please excuse my voice and my hat. I'm getting over a cold, but my parents moved to Montreal, Canada in 2002, and they founded the Living Room as a church as 2 pastors. And I was born there in 2004 and grew up in I'd say probably a very spiritually mature environment. And I got the opportunity that a lot of kids don't have, of being able to just be immersed in what God can do in a city that's hurting, and a lot of people's hearts and minds who have gone through some crazy experiences. And it was really a blessing looking back now, especially as almost an adult, just seeing how blessed I was to be in that position. And I was there for about, 10 years. And throughout that time, my parents ministered to the people of Montreal, and it was very much a mission-based church of Jesus came to spread the gospel, and that's exactly what we're going to do. And we're going to try to reach as many people as possible. And in the process, the Father's heart and how God loves his children was kind of lost a bit for our family. And in 2014, it was time to kind of go fundraising again through Every Nation. So we packed up our van and we drove across the United States and met with a whole bunch of amazing people, just trying to fundraise for our church. And throughout that time, my parents were somewhat sensing in their spirit that a change was about to happen. So they talked with a bunch of their mentors, and they kind of came to the conclusion to go through RTF, which is Restoring the Foundation Ministries. And that's kind of when some major healing and a major turn of events for our lives happened, and our whole family dynamic changed from there forward.
When you tell us a little bit about, so you ended up they went through RTF first, Restoring the Foundations. And then I remember getting a call from your dad saying they really had sense to now move back to Wisconsin and take care of your grandparents. And then you guys went through it. Do you remember how old you were when you went through that, Aileen?
Yeah, I think I was about 10 years old, slightly younger than my youngest sister is now, which is interesting, being able to see where she is in her life and knowing that that's where I was during that time. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it was definitely a life-changing experience. And I definitely think that because I was younger, it somewhat allowed me to have a little bit more of an open heart than I probably would now, just because I wasn't viewing the world through the eyes of a realistic adult, if that makes sense. I was still kind of in that world of possibility and opportunity. And being around so many spiritually mature people and seeing how God works, I was very optimistic for what could happen during that time.
Cool. Do you tell us, lead up a little bit to how that came about? Did your parents just announce to you guys, or how did you end up, because not many people have heard of the ministry like that. I think it was a grandfather with his daughter and that did the ministry, if I recall right. And but go back to that moment and take us back to that. What was that like for you? Did your parents come to you, or were you aware of things going on inside of you? What was your perspective of yourself, and why would you go do it?
Yeah, my parents had kind of sensed we needed a little bit of healing to kind of move forward, and that big change that they were sensing in their spirit. They weren't totally sure what it was yet, but it was in the end moving back to Wisconsin to take care of my grandparents. I'm actually in the room that was my dad's bedroom when he was a little boy right now, so it's been very full circle. And as a kid, my parents were pretty open about what was going on spiritually for them, because a lot of times what was going on for them would kind of depend on the trajectory of our family and where we would go and what we would do. So they were very open of what Restoring the Foundations would be. And they were kind of telling us what they were sensing about moving away. And they were asking our opinion about certain things. And the whole story of, I believe it was Peter trying to walk on the water when Jesus was out there with him, and kind of him just taking that step of faith was what I remember thinking of and sharing that story with my parents. And that kind of kickstarted the whole thing. With RTF, I didn't quite know what to expect, and I hadn't gone through any healing to the depth that RTF does. And as a kid, I was very unaware of all of the lies that I was believing, and even some of the experience that I had that had made an imprint on my heart that I wasn't aware of. And it was just, there's so many things that happened during that time. We went through what it was like to hear God's voice. I discovered that I had the gift of being a seer, and one of the ladies who was there, her dad and her together were the team that we partnered with. And she was also a seer, so she was able to help me kind of interpret what that meant. And during that time, I really, really got to understand how God spoke to me, and how RTF kind of gave me the springboard to move forward with what it meant to be a daughter of God and to hear his voice. But they were also really clear of you don't necessarily need professional guidance or professional healing to know what God's voice sounds like and to be able to apply it to yourself. He's so accessible to everybody. And I think for our family, it was a good place to start for us to kind of get the guidance to begin, and kind of getting our godly identities and understanding who we are in God, and identifying very specific moments of whether it be traumatic memory or people we met, or even stuff that was spoken over us that we weren't even aware of, and just healing those things. And the big thing that I remember was being able to recognize that because God is omniscient, he is fully in our past, fully in our present, and fully in our future. And because of that, he can heal every single part of those. And by being able to heal my past, he was able to help me redeem my present, and then in the process, give me a hope for the future, which was it was just a mind-blowing experience.
Oh man. It's so much in that. Okay, give us an example. What was, maybe if you feel comfortable with it, what was one of the lies that you remember it came up like, oh, I didn't even know I'm thinking that as a 11-year-old?
I just by nature, I'm a very controlling and prideful person. I pride myself in what I can do, and many times my identity is placed on what I can accomplish or what I've earned, especially with school and getting good grades. That's just, what I like to do and where I find my worth. And one of the lies that was brought up during that time was just the whole idea of controlling, and how that's based in fear, and how because I was living out of a place of fear, I wasn't trusting God in the most genuine way I could. And because of that, I was really doubting his capability for me, and thinking that I had to make up for it with whether it be just making decisions or it ended up falling on my shoulders, which isn't what it should be. We should be able to trust him fully. And it was just amazing, just through the leadership of the couple we were with, and how they were able to just kind of guide me through hearing God's voice, and then just reassuring me that you don't necessarily have to try to hear his voice. You just have to be open to hearing it. And it ended up being so seamless and effortless. And every time I tried to hear his voice, or like consciously listened for an audible sound or something, it never worked. But when I just let go and kind of abdicate control, which was the hardest thing for me at that moment, he always spoke to me. There was never a doubt in my mind about that. And I slowly learned to trust him with that, and trust that even though I wasn't sure what was going on, he did. And that should be enough for me.
It's amazing. It's amazing, Greta. It's interesting. Just so many people have wrestled through not knowing how fear is blocking their capacity to hear, So you were 11 and your sisters were younger. And can you describe what we talked a little bit before we came on? And I just want to put this in context for people who are listening, that, they had a mission, they were, as you said earlier, up in Montreal. Tell us how that you think might have affected you or your family. You made a comment about, boy, if we hadn't, how much your lives have changed as a result, but put it in the context of trying to walk the talk versus do the mission, something like that we were talking about.
Yeah. Well, growing up as a pastor's kid, I was placed in many unique situations, and kind of using my parents as a role model, and just seeing how they would react to certain situations, or just how they led their spiritual family. And they were living and pastoring at a place. They had such a servant's heart, which is always very good. But when it's somewhat directed in the wrong way, it's not as effective as it could be. And the entire church was being led out of a place of, let's reach as many people as possible. And the whole idea of having everybody connect with the Father's heart and actually feeling his love, and then out of that love, pastoring towards people, was kind of missed. And I think that was unknowingly neglected in our family as well. And I never remember when I was younger ever talking specifically about the Father's love in our house. It was more about what Jesus had done. And because he's called my parents to do that, our mission is to reach people and to tell them about what Jesus did for them. And only after RTF, and I think this has a lot to do with my parents' healing as well, did we really start talking about the Father's love and how we're each uniquely loved by him, and how we just need the Father's love constantly raining down on us in order to live our lives well and to hear his voice. And now living here, which is so funny, we had that revelation out of ministry once my parents stopped pastoring, is we're living out of a place of that now. And I feel like our family is just so much healthier, and it's all rooted in God's love and not necessarily what we can do for him. It's more like seeing what he's done for us and how that applies.
That's great.
Yeah.
You made a comment that really struck me earlier, Greta, and that was the comment that there was something about going through it together. You mentioned that because oftentimes people will go through healing of their hearts individualistically, but you guys kind of ended up kind of doing it all within a certain time frame. You mentioned earlier how that created a dynamic from your perspective as an 11-year-old and 12-year-old.
Yeah.
Describe that. Yeah. What that felt like.
I'd say that at least one of the areas in particular that was really changed was my relationship with my siblings. I have 2 younger sisters, and it was really neat to be able to see how, because each of us were individually healed, we were all able to get together and be healed as one, and be able to hear each other out of a place of love and not out of a place of comparison or unforgiveness or bitterness, which is where we were seeing each other from before. And I was in particular able to see how, because of my place of living through fear, that reflected on how I treated other people, and most specifically my sisters, and being scared that they would make the same mistakes I did. So in the process, I ended up hurting them more than if I wouldn't have tried. And because we were all being healed together and we're able to see each other's changes, our perspective of each other's changed. We weren't seeing each other through our flesh and our unforgiveness or the bitterness that we have. We were seeing each other the way that God did, which I think could have only happened if we were all doing that together. And we saw each other change in front of our eyes as we did that. And though it was a gradual change and some people had a harder time than others, when we left RTF and we kind of started this new journey in America, it was so different and it was so good. We all felt like a huge burden was taken off our shoulders.
So great. What would you say, Greta? Or for 2 questions. One would be, when you were, what you remember of being 11 or 10 in that range, and you're moving back to the States, were you aware of fear inside of yourself? Like you said, it wasn't until you were doing it that you were like, oh, but were you aware of it?
I think I was aware of it. I mean, I was, and this revelation is still coming to me as I get older. I mean, even just seeing how my youngest sister reacts to certain things, I'm like, that's exactly what I did. And it's rooted in this place of, you're in such a different perspective when you're younger, and you don't necessarily see the full picture, or having to go through this to make sure that this takes place and things of that sort. But I think I was aware of what fear was, but fear, the idea of being scared, scared me. So I was in such a place of fear that I don't even think that I knew that God could redeem me in that place. And I was seeing the world through fearful eyes. So any decisions that I made, whether it be, checking behind the closet door before I went to bed and checking under my bed to make sure there was nothing there, and or kind of I had to make my bed a certain way every night because if I didn't, something bad might happen, or just things like that. And seeing into the spiritual realm and not being aware that I was seeing into the spiritual realm was also kind of weird. And because I was seeing things out of a fearful place, nothing was good for me. And us living in Montreal, which can be kind of a sketchy city sometimes, that didn't really help either. So I feel like I was constantly on watch and constantly in a defensive posture. And once I realized that I didn't have to be scared all the time and having my shoulders up tight, it just completely changes how you see everything, and nothing looks the same after. And you kind of realize how silly some of those things were, because you're living out of this place of fantasy almost, and creating fears out of things that you shouldn't be. And yeah, it's been amazing, as growing into an adult, being able to look back and still continue to identify things that I did believe, or that I even still believe now that I shouldn't. And slowly getting healed from those things has been a real journey, and is definitely still taking place. But I love how God's still refreshing my memory and still showing me new things of the same thing that I've seen so many times before, which I think is so neat.
That's great. When we started talking, everyone, this morning, I mentioned that I'm going to ask her some questions about going back 11 years. And she goes, it's been a while since I've talked about this, and you're doing amazing. Thank you for bringing us into it. A couple of questions. My second question would be, eventually other people will be listening to this, and there's going to be anywhere between 6-year-olds and 12-year-olds and 15-year-olds, and who knows, us, most of us on the screen are 30 or under, that's our, but what would you say, how would you encourage, like your younger sister's age, how would you encourage them to not be afraid, or how to step into, what would you encourage them with?
Yeah. I think that as kids, we are very reliant on our parents, and we rely on them for a lot of things. But then many times, like for example, we were talking about this, Brant, like when you fall off your bike and hurt yourself, you're either the kind of kid who really cries about it and needs consolidation, or you kind of don't want to ride the bike again. And I think we should almost view God as that parent who cares for us and loves us so deeply and knows us so much better than we could know ourselves. He's 10 times better than our earthly parents could ever be. And any mistakes that our parents have made, or even in ways that they don't necessarily understand what we're going through, God does. And I think almost just being willing to kind of take that step of faith and let go, and just be like, okay, I'm not totally sure what I believe of you yet, and I would love to see the way that you want to speak to me, God. Please just reveal yourself to me. And that's all you need to do, is you just need to put yourself in a stance of wanting to hear and wanting to learn. And having a humble spirit is so important, even though, at least for me, I wanted to do everything I could to make things right and do things the right way, make sure all my ducks were in a row. But that's just not how God works. He meets us where we're at, which means that we don't need to change anything beforehand. Which to me was the most comforting thing. He can meet us anywhere, whether we're 8 or 100 years old. It doesn't matter. We're all his kids. And if we approach him with a childlike spirit and a humble spirit, he'll reveal himself to you in ways that you might not even expect.
Fantastic. I wish I was 8 again. What would you say to parents that are listening, who are in various stages of parenting? And it's interesting because you're about 8, you're turning 18 in a week, and it's interesting as we get older, we start to realize, some of our parents is things we took for granted or whichever. But what kind of advice would you give to parents as a seer, even, if you could go back and it'd be like speaking to your parents, 10 years ago or something, and saying, yeah, now that you see this, what would you say to the parents listening now?
Mm-hmm. I'd say that it's okay that you don't know everything. And in some ways that's good, because it opens a door for God to reveal things to you about your kids that you don't even know. And so many of the challenges that are either family-based, which is what we experience, or even just what each individual child is facing, is so much spiritually and attached with the spiritual realm. Many of the things we see in the physical aren't an accurate representation of what's going on in the spiritual. And I think being prayerful and constantly asking for kind of hitting the refresh button for God and saying, okay, just reveal to me what's going on, and asking him to reveal things in the spiritual sense, because our fight isn't against flesh and blood, it's against powers and authorities. And I think asking God to reveal to you what's going on in the spiritual is super important, because how kids react in the natural and what we see is many times a representation of an internal battle. And for me, this happened as an older sister. Our immediate reaction is like, are you kidding? Go sit in the corner. Why did you do that? And kind of reprimand them, which in a sense is good because discipline is healthy. But being able to look past that and get to the root of the issue, which can be the most treacherous part. But having God in the center of that journey is super important. That's probably what I would say.
Fantastic. Greta, with that was it was about 11 years ago, or 7 years ago approximately, when you went through that. Can you describe, since that time till now, we had a conversation a few months ago which triggered this opportunity, and you were sitting beside your dad and you looked at him and you said, Dad, weren't we just talking about this, that it's not a one and done thing, it's a journey, we talked about an adventure, so how do you see that moment these last few years? Do you see it? Obviously you're hearing his voice and things like that. How do you now deal with some of the things that come up in your heart?
I just have a completely different perspective of when things come my way or how I hear God. Because again, I was seeing everything through the lens of fear and being scared of what could happen. I had zero faith. And I was always thinking of the what ifs, what if this happens, and it was always on the extremes of what if my parents die? I'm going to need to take care of my sisters. How am I going to do that? Or just crazy examples like that. And I can't even imagine where I'd be now if I was still in that place. And knowing that God was able to redeem me then, he's more than able to redeem me right now. And just knowing that I'm constantly needing to nourish myself in order to thrive where he's placed me, because we weren't meant to do things by our own strength. And all of us have experienced that at some point of trying to do things out of our own power, and it does not work out. And having God by our side the entire time, he's always there. He's just waiting for us to ask for him and ask for his love to be given to us. And just knowing that he's always there just completely changes my perspective. Recently, I got, what's the word I'm looking for? I wasn't accepted to the college I wanted to go to. And for me, my entire next 4 years of my life were planned out. And everybody I knew was so certain I was going to get in. If you don't get in, there's something wrong with the admissions team or whatever. And not being accepted kind of shifted my perspective a bit. And now I'm placed in that fearful state again of like, okay, I need to figure this out. But in reality, I don't, because God already sees my future. And because he sees my future, he's going to make sure that I'm tended to and cared for and provided for in my present. And that's something I'm constantly needing to remind myself of. I still fall into my fearful tendencies a lot of the time, but knowing that God is bigger than that really changes my perspective on things.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Two questions. One is, and feel free, it's a personal one, Greta. It's more of I know you're living with your grandfather in that same house, and he went through a pretty harrowing experience with respect to COVID, and I think, is he 90?
He's 91.
91.
Yeah.
And you've watched your parents, and you've been living in a house where, there was interventions going on and things. How did your heart handle that? How did you obviously watched God in the midst of all that, but tell us a little bit about that moment.
I think the thing that struck me the most, just kind of watching from the sidelines, because as a granddaughter, I can't do very much in terms of intervening or helping out. I mean, my dad is constantly saying that my grandpa, knowing that we're here is enough for him, and, being around in community with us. But I think the thing that stood out to me the most was how my grandfather reacted to all the things that were happening to him. I'd say we're very similar in a lot of ways. He's a very prideful person and likes to do things himself. And if it's not done a certain way, he will do it for you. Up until maybe a year and a half ago, he was still doing yard work. He was on the ski patrol. He's a very healthy guy. And I think he was still thinking he could do a bunch of the things that he could when he was 18 years old, but he's in his 90s now. And he still is kind of resistant to the help that my dad and his siblings are wanting to give to their dad. And seeing his resistance and the fear that he was living out of reminded me of where I was and where I tend to go. But then the minute he kind of just abdicate responsibility in certain sense for certain things that he used to be responsible for, or abdicate control and let my dad and his sisters just take care of him and just to love him, he just was a completely different person. And he's so much more open to help now. And it's just so nice to see him open to being taken care of, because that's a super vulnerable place to be. And I think a lot of times in our vulnerability is where God meets us. And even though my grandpa doesn't know God, I think he was met in a certain way through how my dad and his siblings treated him, and they're serving out of a godly place. So he was met with God's love to a certain extent during that time. And yeah, it was amazing to just see that transition.
Right. Well, that's beautiful, Greta. Second question here, and then we'll open it up for some others. It's a question that take you back to 7 years ago. You're about to step into ministry with into that time with that couple, and some people are curious about what was that like. What was the process that you went through? Because some people are aware of restoring the foundations more from an adult's perspective with checklists and not checklists, but it's a little bit more aimed at an adult mind. So what was it? Can you describe the process for being an 11-year-old?
It was very helpful having my parents kind of lead what we were doing, and I was kind of along for the ride. I didn't know where we were going. I knew we were going for healing and things of that sort, but I wasn't totally aware of what was going on until we got there, until the couple kind of explained things to me. And I've been told by a lot of people, especially in Montreal, that I've been very mature for my age. And I think it's because of the situation I was placed in. And I was around such spiritually mature people, which truly impacted me. And I think one of the things that I realized was, even though I was mature at that time, I almost had to let go of that maturity and truly release my inner child that hadn't been, because only in that childlike faith can God speak to you. And in that humble spot can he truly reveal himself to you. And I think our whole process of just finding the house that we stayed in, them coming in every day, it was a whole week-long process. And it was amazing because they kind of let me lead the way on how healing was to take place. They really trusted God to reveal himself to me. And then out of that place, I'd reveal what had been shared with me the night before, or I had a dream one night and I'd kind of share with them what that was like, and they'd interpret it and ask me questions. And it was just super hands-on. And there were certain days where they would just say, all right, we're just going to sit for a bit and you just tell us what comes to your head. And that was just me learning to hear God's voice and see how he spoke to me. He speaks to me a lot through visions and pictures, as well as certain words that might come to my head. There are many times where a random Bible verse just pops up and I'm like, let's just see what this says. And of course, it relates to the situation that's going on in my life. But just kind of almost training myself to hear God's voice and be attuned to it. We went through some days of kind of attacking certain lies, or just being in the moment and praying for God to reveal a moment to me in my past where I was either hurt or I was living out a place of unforgiveness or things of that sort, which was so neat. And just it was amazing to me looking back. Actually, this is the first time I've really talked about it. Just seeing how he was able to reveal himself to 11-year-old me to the extent that he did just shows that that type of healing and revelation is possible for truly anybody.
Oh, that's amazing. That's wonderful. There's I've got a lot more questions, but it's Greta, I just want to first take a breather here. It is just wonderful hearing the clarity in which you share, and I know everybody listening is drinking all this in. We're not talking to a teenager. We're listening to the wisdom of God that's changed your heart. And my last little question, and if any come into Jody, she can trigger them. But we talked a little bit. You recently, or I don't know how recently, you were back at school. You were at school, and we were having this conversation about how it was unique because of the journey you've been on. The healing journey makes it a bit different when you're around other kids who may or may not have been through anything similar to this. Describe what that felt like and what you've learned about that.
Yeah. So for my freshman and part of my sophomore year of high school, I attended our public high school here in the city that we're living in. It was actually the high school that my dad and all of his siblings went to and graduated from. So it's just been really neat to see that take place. But after RTF and kind of our move from one country to another, it was very much a culture shock. We went from a very large multicultural city to a suburban town primarily made up of white Americans. And just having the perspective that I did moving, it was really, really neat being able to see where God met our family and provided for us along the way. And having that perspective that a lot of other kids don't made it really interesting when relating and conversing with kids my own age. I found that a lot of times what they wanted to talk about wasn't necessarily what I wanted to talk about. I mean, they'd be off partying and vaping and drinking until 2 a.m. most nights. And then I'd come in refreshed from church the previous night. And it was just a very different dynamic. And I found myself at some points kind of leaning back into that prideful, controlling state of, wow, you guys are really destroying your lives. I guess I know what I'm doing and you don't. And somewhat looking down on them when I should have the heart posture of, no, God can reach you where you are because he reached me where I was. I was no better than you are right now. And just kind of no matter what they would say to me, being able to just respond to them with what God would want to share with them. And it's so funny because I recently over the past 7 years since RTF, actually, I've had a lot of times with deja vu and dreams, and God has been speaking to me through a lot of dreams. And there have been countless times when I was at Muskego High School where I'd see a person or I'd be in the middle of a conversation or I'd pass by a window or something, and I would remember it from a dream that I'd had months prior, and just kind of knowing that God is in those moments, even when you're in the weirdest of circumstances with the weirdest people. And it was super comforting knowing that he was there. And I no longer attend Muskego High School. I'm homeschooled right now. But looking back on those moments and just seeing the people that I was with and even the teachers that I talked with, how just because they're in a certain situation doesn't mean that God can't reach them. And just being open to his voice. There are so many times where he can give you a word to share with somebody, and it might be super random and awkward to walk up to them and share that word, but God knows it and you don't, and you can just be a vessel through him. And that was really neat to see how he worked in very small circumstances.
That's very good. Did you, when it comes to my mind, Greta, being in that environment, how do you notice that you're able to I don't know if it's able, but how do you respond to temptation? Because there is a lot going on in your generation, social media and all that kind of stuff. And kids have such access to so many things. So, you mentioned, I think at one time, some girls are hanging around looking at their phones or something, and you're having to decide, do I connect in that or what, to be in the world but not of it kind of deal. So describe that for how that tension has gone for you. And
yeah, well, just in general, I have a hard time relating with kids my own age anyway. I was around adults as a child, so I spoke with adults most of the time and fellowshiped with them, which I think had an impact on my worldview and my perspective now. But I don't even have my own cell phone. So I am not indented with social media whatsoever. And being around a culture that does, I found that many kids kind of looked at me weird when I didn't know something, or I wasn't aware that a celebrity had broken up with their boyfriend or something like that. None of that was aware to me. And I think just in terms of temptation, kind of reflecting on how God has redeemed me in the past and how much better I feel being with God than taking part in things that other people are. that temptation sometimes doesn't even show up, which I'm very grateful for. I'm around a family who doesn't take part in many of the things that the world does, and I'm constantly around godly people. And that really has affected what choices I've made, whether it be online or around other people. And I've been so grateful to not even be tempted by some of those things. I've never wanted to take part in drugs or social media or any of that stuff, because I've seen the effects that it's had on people's lives in Montreal. We dealt with a lot of drug abuse cases and alcohol abuse cases, and there were some people who had been sexually abused, and just seeing how that affects them as adults. And then me as a kid just being like, I don't want to waste my time like that. But it's the really neat thing was that even people who had experienced that, all the time that God is able to catch up with, regardless of what happened, he works all things for the good. And I think that to me stands out more than anything. And yeah, I'm just very grateful he's still revealing things to me now, and that I'm in this position in life right now where I'm not tempted by those things anymore, which I'm very grateful for.
That's fantastic. Oh, what a great. I think someone had a question. If you would be along the lines of when you run into somebody that you're pretty aware that they don't know God in the sense of, your interactions, what's your, how do you connect with them? How do you, I know my daughter's been asked this, being a PK kid, what was it like? And she was on a podcast recently, and she said, I'm sorry, I can't answer the weird questions because I don't think we were ever religious. But yeah, tell us, because there's parents here that would be listening down the road, and they're thinking, how do they position, how do you interact with people who don't, quote, know God, friends or groups at school and stuff? And it can be a lonely road at times, but yeah, share what you've.
Yeah, it's definitely really, really hard. Thankfully, I knew a few people who had gone to the church that we did, who went to Muskego High School, that I got to hang out with. But even then, they hadn't been given the opportunity to receive revelation and meet God the way my family had. And I think constantly, every day I woke up from Muskego High School, I'd ask God for me to see him throughout my day, because if I wasn't seeing the world through his eyes, it would just drain me. I'd be super tired and crabby, and I'd get home and treat my parents and my sisters terribly because I was intaking what other people were doing and not what God was wanting to share with me. I think it's honestly just a lot of perseverance and trusting in what God can do, and not necessarily what I can do, because it's God speaking through me that touches people. It's not what I tell them. And it's funny because a lot of times throughout my experience at Muskego High School, I mean, I never swear or took part in any of that stuff. When kids would talk about certain topics, I just wouldn't take part. And people started to notice that. So whenever I'd walk in to a room or whatever, people would be like, dude, don't swear, Greta's here. And I never told them any of that stuff, or never specifically told them to not do that around me. But that's just how God works. And it's not out of our own power. It's out of the Spirit that lives in us. And I think things became easier as the Spirit worked through me and how it touched other people. It didn't get too much easier just because you're constantly around people who are choosing to do things. It's every day it surprised me, something that I'd heard about what happened the other day at the high school or what kids chose to take part in. There was always something crazy. And because there's always something new and different, I just constantly remind myself of God saying that there's nothing new under the sun. They're hurting just as much as you are and how much you were. And don't see them for what they're doing. See them as who they are, because they're still children of God just as much as I am. And they need God just as much as I do. And even though I wasn't able to touch as many people or make as many friends as I'd hoped, I think being at the high school was a very unique experience to be able to just see how God revealed himself to me, helps me to make choices, and then how that reacts on the complete opposite end of the spectrum.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I'll end with this question, and we don't want to make the recording go on and on, but I know we could. It is so good, Greta. at some point, there's going to be parents here that will probably they can access this recording and talk about it and probe down the row. How would you speak to, what would you, if you had the opportunity to sit in a room with kids that are between whatever ages, and they really wonder how they hear God or if they can. And you said that was a big step for you, 7 years ago. Do you want to just kind of lay it out there? What would you tell them? And it's okay, press in, experiment, or whatever, discover. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, definitely learning to hear God was something that I would stress about all the time because I knew that I wouldn't be able to get through life without God. But in my mind, I was questioning that if I can't even hear God, how am I going to know what choices to make or who to spend time with, or how am I going to know when what I'm doing is what God wants me to do? And really, the only time I've ever heard God is when I'm not stressing about it. And when I just kind of let go and be open to what he has to say. Because so many times I find myself, whether I'm aware of it or not, wanting him to speak to me a certain way. And in my mind, I think if he doesn't speak to me that certain way, then he probably didn't hear me, or he doesn't speak to me at all, when he can speak to you in so many different ways. And if you're open to that, you're going to see him in the everyday all the time. You're going to hear him in the way that he speaks to you. It's similar with spiritual gifts. All of them are different, but the same God gives them to each of us. And neither one of them is better or worse than the other, but God speaks to us in so many different ways. So for me, God speaks to me in pictures or in what I see in the spiritual realm. But then for Abby, a lot of time God speaks to her just in stuff that she thinks about sometimes and the questions that she asks. And then we just hear God in so many different ways. And I think just being open to even the opportunity of hearing from him and not kind of putting him in a box of, well, if you only speak to me in this way, then you care about me. Because he's gonna reveal himself to you if you ask. Seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open to you.
I love it. Well, Greta, thank you so much.